Greetings. As most of you know by now, this is a recording that's being made the following day after the live classroom that we had on Zoom for this second in the series with the poetry of Cold Mountain. I called this one Continuing with Cold Mountain. And once again, I apologize for not initiating the recording yesterday. I was very caught up in a lot of technological things and preparation and just simply didn't remember to do it. So I apologize for that, and we'll go back through the information now. I'll also be sending you a PDF of my notes so that you can use it as a study guide in returning to the information that we're using here. So wherever you are listening this time, welcome. In each class, we usually have a brief sitting period. And even though it's a little bit brief, it's sort of nice to settle. If you're listening to this and want to do so, you can always pause the recording and take a short time to sit alone or in the small group in which you're meeting. And it might assist you in settling into the class. One of the things that I mentioned in the initiation of the sitting time in the class was that the gifts that come through our meeting, the gifts that arrive in the class, come in equal proportion to your level of participation and what you offer to the class. This is obvious for most people, of course, as you receive things in response to what you offer. And in this case, I think it's doubly important because of this format, because we're meeting online, and so many of us aren't in the same place. We look for ways to encourage and support engagement. And this is also why I entitled the class, or titled it, Walking with Hanshan, rather than Studying Hanshan. Because this sort of walking together, this shared engagement is really the key. So if you're with a group or a small sitting group, you can sit together and read together, enjoy the class together, and share this experience. I think it will really add to the depth of the Cold Mountain pilgrimage. Let's start with a poem that does call forward this spirit of engagement. It's poem number 60. And I hope that most of you, of course, have the book by this time. And I'll give you a moment to look at poem number 60, in which Hanshan says, if you remain silent and don't speak, what will your descendants say? If you hide in a forest or a bamboo grove, how will your wisdom shine through? A withered tree is not protected. Wind and frost cause disease. If you plow a graveled field with an ox, how will you ever harvest rice? So I think he is speaking to this vulnerable edge of engagement and any beliefs that we carry that would be a barrier to engagement. If you remain silent and don't speak, what will your descendants say? In other words, who will know what you were, what you offered? It's a larger question about practice, of course. If you hide in a forest or bamboo grove, how will your wisdom shine through? And if you plow a gravel field with an ox, how will you ever harvest rice? How will you ever reap the benefits of practice if you don't cultivate an appropriate field? One of the things that was brought up in the initial class experience, I thought, which was important, was a question that Kim Nichelle brought up, who's been our just former head student in Madison. She said there's this call forward to engagement and connection, and yet Hanshan was a hermit. He had stepped away from the world in one way. She said, how do you understand that? And we had some discussion about this. I think in some ways it's quite useful to think of it as you would a koan. There are immense benefits to stepping out of the busyness of everyday life, whether in a retreat, just a morning or evening sitting, a longer intensive retreat, or maybe a longer period of practice if you were to go into a monastery. There are reasons for that. Making it your entire life is another matter. There are also reasons to step forward, to act, to be of benefit in the world. And these things have to be in some balance based on what you are called to in your life. And everyone's life is not the same. And everyone's call to practice is not the same. It's going to look different. So even in this place of stepping out, Hanshan is talking about the necessity of coming forward. An in-breath, an out-breath, these two sides have to be balanced in some way. The homework that I invited you to engage in, writing about someone who had helped shape your life, reflecting on your inmost request, noticing what these poems are bringing forward in you and what conversations you might have if you were actually walking with Hanshan, brought forward some really beautiful responses. And the request to speak and not be quiet, to show yourself, to reveal yourself, was responded to quite elegantly by Cassie Wayant, one of our senior students in Austin, who's helped us quite a bit with our recordings and things that you see on Vimeo. And listen to what she wrote. This is quite lovely. She said, this question, and she's referring to the question about coming forward. This question uncovers its opposite, the malware running in the background. My belief that the truest part of me is unwanted and unlovable. It's almost poetic. This question uncovers its opposite. And sometimes the questions that we meet in practice are like a probe that calls forward something very much unlike what's being called for. She calls it, because she has a technical background, the malware running in the background. The virus has infected the system, such as a belief that the truest part of her was not wanted, was not lovable. It reminds me of the statement from, I think it's from the Course in Miracles, love brings up everything unlike itself. We step into a place of invitation and care and love. Things come forward that seem very much unlike that. The question uncovers its opposite. She wrote further. When we met, and she was at that point writing about me and my influence on her, she said, when we met, my main practice was to deny my spiritual life. I wonder if that might be something that reflects for some of you, that actually her practice, if she was honest, was the denial of her spiritual life. We met in a wedding in which she was a photographer. So she says it was Charla's wedding. I showed up as my occupation, photographer. The camera allowed me access to life through a small window in a black box back then, that was all I could take in. But that process put me in the present moment in a creative mindset. And then she says quite beautifully, for 1/60th of a second, I could see with Hanshan's eyes. For that tiny moment, she could see with some clarity, with some creativity, with some openness in the present moment. And of course, the intention over time in practice is for that 1/60th of a second to broaden. And that's, in fact, been my experience with Cassie and many, many students over the years. That's what she's done, what she's dedicated herself to, and what's so beautiful. Here's actually something that I wrote several years ago in an email. I'm not trying to liken it to something more important like the Genjo Koan, but it's interesting that the Genjo Koan, which we study from Dogen, was actually a letter to a student. It wasn't a treatise written for a large group of people who would read it or a Dharma talk. It was a personal communication. And what I'm about to read was such a personal communication. Suzanne Kilkus, our first head student in Madison actually, has for many years managed the retreats there in Madison. And in one of our conversations about what was important for the next retreat, coming up with a theme, a title, a description, she had asked me some questions. And I sent her this brief piece this was an email in response to a question she had raised about the retreat topic. Surprisingly, it ended up being the description of the retreat. And later on, the Sangha in Lancaster in the UK, Josh and Trudy, took this as a guiding inspiration for that Sangha, which is now named Nothing Missing. And that's the name of the piece, Nothing Missing. This is what I wrote. We tend to think that we are a problem to be solved. Consciously or unconsciously, we have this uneasy feeling that something is missing. Something's not quite right. From a psychological point of view, we think the problem is our conditioning. If we could only identify and then work with that conditioning, we might find relief from our shaky identity and establish a strong sense of self that is robust and healthy. From a spiritual point of view, we hope to either affirm a belief system we can rely on forever, or dedicate ourselves to a set of practices that will eventually end our suffering and assuage this existential sense of lack. The result is often that we either work endlessly towards psychological self-improvement or become a perpetual spiritual seeker looking for nirvana. Both paths to salvation are flawed because they both miss the shadow aspect of this pervasive, what I'm calling a sense of lack. Our deepest fears are not that we'll actually never be good enough or that we will eventually die. The shadow fear, the one we least want to face, is that the sense of self we rely on for our identity is in truth groundless and without substance. Nothing is missing. We're always perfectly ourselves. The thing we cling to the most, our sense of self, is not worthy of our faith and trust. We cling to our conditioning and forsake our true nature. This is both the promise and call of spiritual practice, that we would step beyond the small sense of self. And when we chant, caught in the self-centered dream, only suffering, we're affirming that that is the caught place. Holding the self-centered thoughts, exactly the dream. We're understanding how we can maintain that position and turn away from awakening. But that that moment of each moment, life as it is, the only teacher, is the turn phrase in the 4 practice principles. So that being just this moment is compassion's way. Let's look at poem number 108. And remember, as I go through these, if it takes you a moment to find the poem, you can always pause the recording. And I'll go forward. Opening to a larger space, this larger view, this higher perspective, rather than just caught in psychological self-improvement or spiritual seeking. Hanshan says in poem 108, with a vast net of stars, the night is bright and deep. In my cave, I light a single lamp before the moon sets. Its full radiance is not a polished jade hanging in the blue sky. This is my heart. And there's so much beauty in those 4 lines. Just a couple of nights ago, from our deck here on this little ridge in Molokai, on a very, very clear night, we could see the Milky Way, the vast net of stars. The night is bright and deep, and it was. The moon had not come up yet. The sky was clear. We could see so many stars, infinite number, and that beautiful cloud of stars going across the sky. And now and then, a few shooting stars. You got a glimpse of those. Second line, in my cave, I light a single lamp before the moon sets. It's a nice image of turning on the light before it gets too dark. But it's also a lovely image of in my cave, turning inside, lighting a single lamp. It's the image of enlightenment, turning on a light or radiate. In my cave, in my practice, in my inward turn, in my backward step, I light a single lamp before the moon sets. Its full radiance is not a polished jade hanging in the blue sky. What is its full radiance of what? The moon is setting, the lamp is lit. Its full radiance is not a polished jade hanging in the blue sky. Then he claimed, this is my heart. All of this is actually held within this big, big heart mind. I'm thinking that very likely the ideogram that was translated as heart here must have been that Chinese heart mind. Also very likely, under such a vast net of stars in the American Western landscape, I'm going to read a piece from another student who wrote in response to the homework from last time, in which she made a phone call to her teacher back in the UK and offers him her heart. She questions the need or the relevance of doing really formal Zen work and asks for something different. Here's what she wrote. Phoning him from the side of the road in a dusty Utah landscape, months since we'd spoken. I don't really have anything to ask, she said, but I'm calling. His kind British voice on the line, which I don't have a British voice, but his kind British voice on the line. How good to hear you. All my doubts and hesitations melted. I told him, I don't have a question. We can work with who am I, in other words, a traditional koan, but it's not real for me. All I have is a burning. And very beautifully, the teacher said, and that will do. She's confessed, my practice is all silted up. Yes, he said, accepting that. He told us in his talk, this practice is not about love. It's not about emotion. Then he asked me in Dokusan, in a private interview, you have a lot of love in you, a surprising amount. It can help. In this interchange that she writes about, she says, like I've felt so many times, I wanted to meet Blanche in Dokusan in practice discussion when I went for a retreat, even though I didn't have a question. I didn't know what to ask. Well, but I knew to respond to the burning, to the question of the longing to come forward. And he says to her, when she mentions that, that will do, that's enough. And this is what I want when students come to me. They don't have to have a well-formed question, but I want them to be in touch with what brings them. And she talks about being a bit stuck and that maybe you get, and he says, yes, accepting that. And that kind of acceptance is really useful rather than trying to fix, change, challenge, criticize even, which wouldn't do, but just accepting, yes. I know that because I know that place in me. And he says, you know, this practice isn't about a traditional emotional sense of love. And yet, he said, you have a lot of love in you and it can really help. This is Hanshan saying, this is my heart. This is what I bring. This is my heart. Let's look at poem number 115, 115. And he talks about this concern he has about where our words land or how we do shape each other. He says, if Coal Mountain utters these words, no one will believe them. Honey is sweet for people to enjoy, but bitter bark keeps them away. Going along with people's feelings brings pleasure. Opposing their ideas sparks resentments. Just look at wooden puppets acting out their tragic scenes. If Coal Mountain utters these words, no one will believe them. If this old hermit in the mountains speaks, who's going to really listen? He knows that if you were to say something sweet, people will be drawn to it. If you say something difficult, people will be repelled by it. If you go along with people's feelings, it'll bring them pleasure. If you oppose their ideas, you'll trigger difficulties and arguments. And then he uses the image, just look at wooden puppets acting out their tragic scenes. It was a classic thing in the markets in China to have little puppets telling stories. Is one of the ways the stories were passed down to kids. But he said, we're like this. We're being pulled by our karma, tossed around like wooden puppets, acting out our tragic scenes when these are the ways that we interact. But if we could actually hear the words of true teaching from the teacher, either this one or another one, something could maybe come forward differently. How do we come to terms with this deep, fundamental, natural human need for love and companionship? And at the same time, our longing to understand the deepest truths of our life beyond our shaky emotionality and relationships? How do we step outside of everyday habits to see from this higher vantage point I mentioned a moment ago, and yet at the same time keep our feet on the ground? And most of all, what do we do with this burning, this longing? Let's look at number 122. 122. The cold mountain is so strange. All climbers are afraid. The moon shines on crystal water as winds blow, shuffling the grass. Withered plum trees blossom with snow. Bare branches filled with leaves of clouds. Just a touch of rain weakens the spirit. It doesn't matter if the weather's not clear. A couple of the students asked, why is the first line, "Cold Mountain is so strange," in quotation marks? What is that? Now, it could be that people called him strange, this hermit, or he appeared strange, being a hermit, being maybe just because he was somewhat awake, he seemed strange. And then he makes the larger statement, which I think is important for us all. All climbers are afraid. Everyone who enters true practice with some dedication and begins to open their mind and open their heart and open their bodies to practice is going to feel a little bit of fear. If you don't, probably not paying attention or asking enough of yourself. It's not that you should be living with fear, of course. No, I wouldn't want that, but you're going to feel some fears sometimes as you face these ultimate realities in this limited body and mind. The moon shines on crystal waters, winds blow, shuffling the grass. In other words, ordinary things happen as we go through practice. And then these beautiful images: withered plum trees blossom with snow. A tree with no leaves on it, withered, blossoms like it's full of flowers, but it's snow. Bare branches fill with leaves of clouds. Just a touch of rain, a little bit of rain, weakens the spirit. It'll all go away. It looks as if there's something on the tree, but there's not. It doesn't matter if the weather's not clear. That last line is really important to me. Sometimes we want to wait until everything is settled, or we've worked through everything, or all of our questions are answered, or our sort of neurotic struggles have subsided in some way. If the weather will just clear, then we can practice. But he's saying it doesn't matter if the weather's not clear. Bring yourself to practice. Bring yourself to Cold Mountain. Bring yourself to this path. If you look at 125, we'll take another step in which he admits, Cold Mountain, that he admits that he's anxious and he yearns as well, not just that these other climbers. Number 125, sitting alone, I often feel anxious. Just that first line is quite a bit. Sitting alone, I often feel anxious. If you sit long enough, you're going to meet your own anxieties, your own fears, your own concerns. And also, I think sitting alone can be a source of anxiety. Sitting with others sometimes helps meet or at least hold that anxiety. How long will this yearning last? Clouds move slowly across the mountain's waistline. At the mouth of the valley, winds blow chilly and wild. Monkeys arrive in the swaying trees, birds fly in the forest and wail. At this time, melancholy presses against the hair on my temples. The year draws to an end for this sad old man. How long will this yearning last? Well, if you're fortunate, it will last your entire lifetime. The yearning to understand what this life is and to appreciate it fully isn't a problem to be solved. It's the path itself. How long will this yearning last? Clouds move slowly across the mountain's waistline. At the mouth of the valley, winds blow chilly and wild. In other words, seasons change, weather moves. I love being here on this little ridge in Molokai, and I could look across at the valley in front of us, and there's a ridge, and the clouds come in from the North Shore and spill and tumble out over that ridge and move through the valley. And there's a certain beauty and certain melancholy to it. So monkeys arrive in the swaying trees, birds fly in the forest and wail. I think those two lines describe everyday zazen pretty well. Monkeys arrive, monkey mind arrives, birds fly around and wail. Like, gosh, it's kind of active and crazy in there sometimes. At this time, melancholy presses against the hair on my temples. The year draws to an end for this sad old man. At this moment, melancholy presses against the hair on my temples. I'm not sure what that reference might mean. One student yesterday said it's the sense of the hair going gray or white on the temples. Or I said it could be that as we get old, there's a kind of having to hold our hair, but who knows? The year draws to an end for this sad old man. Sitting alone, I often feel anxious. How long will this yearning last? I've had students come and say, I don't have a question, like the woman who wrote that I was reading earlier. I don't have a question, but what about this longing? What do I do with this longing? The same thing came up with another student, Kathy Rashke from Madison, who wasn't able to be in class yesterday because she was traveling. I believe she's in Scotland. But we had an individual practice discussion online before she left, and she was reflecting on the part of the homework about what is my inmost request. And this is a question she'd asked herself before in another retreat. And some things had arisen which were useful for her. And as we spoke recently before her trip, she said, you know, I asked again, I sat with, what is my inmost request? And nothing came up. And when she wrote to me later, she said, I felt a shadow of inadequacy, not having a response. And I made a suggestion. I said, well, Kathy, what if the response to the question is the nothingness, the emptiness, the no narrative? What if that's what's coming forward? She wrote to me later, you suggested I consider nothingness as the response. That led me to remember how I found a line in the book to be very profound. This is the Hanshan book. While talking to you, I thought the line was, and she put in quotes, a person of nothingness. Just checking now, however, I see that it is from a comment on page 6 about a person of non-doing. I shared when we were speaking that I had the insight that non-doing, this space that opened in the question, was larger than the person, and that it held the person situated within this no-thingness, rather than the other way around, like you could find nothingness in the person. This is a larger space, the space of awakening, the space of fullness. She said, I find the mistake interesting, where she thought it was a person of nothingness rather than a person of non-doing. I find the mistake interesting since a person of nothingness fits as well, especially if considered as my inmost request. I find your insight about my inmost request very freeing, and it takes me to a sense of restfulness. But we sometimes have to ask ourselves how, in practice, the world begins to come to us and we experience the world's arrival so differently. Let's look at number 113, poem number 113. Hanshan asks, do I have a body or not? Is this a self or not? I investigate this fully, sitting for a long time, leaning against a rock. Green grass starts to grow between my legs. On top of my head, red dust falls. Already, when worldly people look at me, they offer wine and fruit on the platform of my coffin. So the first bit in this poem reminds me of Dogen. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. He goes on, do I have a body or not? Is this a self or not? I investigate this fully, sitting for a long time, leaning against a rock. I really like that image because he might be leaning against a rock on Cool Mountain, but even those of us in a nice, cozy zendo with cushions and zabatons and zafus, and sometimes it feels like we're against a rock. We found that hard place over time that we meet. Green grass starts to grow between my legs. You sit long enough, things grow around you. If you don't move, things move up through you. On top of my head, red dust falls. I chuckled when I read that line because here in Molokai, those of you that have been here, the earth is very, very red. It has a lot of iron in it from the volcano. And dust, red dust gets in everything. But then the curious line, already when people look at me, already? Not at the end, already. When worldly people still caught in the everyday world, look at me. They offer wine and fruit on the platform of my coffin. What could that be? They offer these generous gifts on the platform of my coffin. When we do a memorial service like I'm about to do in a couple of weeks for our dear friend Robin, who's departed, it's a celebratory function. Offer wine and fruit. That we celebrate a person's life. We celebrate our love for them. Already, when people look at me, like, am I dead? Am I alive? What is this? They offer wine and fruit on the platform of my coffin. When we get to a place like this where we're attempting to interpret, I think this is a really great time to step back for a moment. I made it clear, and I was very explicit in the first class about the poems are adequate in themselves. We don't have to interpret them. We see what's in there. We attempt to resonate with what they're calling for, but not in some academic interpretation. And there's a reason for this, but there's also something really important to remember. I'm going to read just a couple of sentences from quite a long and a very well-known classic essay written by Susan Sontag in 1964. It was the title for the essay was Against Interpretation. And with the poet's and artist's mind on the one hand and the Zen immediacy on the other. Listen to her words. What is important now is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. Our task is not to maximize the amount of content in a work of art, much less to squeeze more content out of the work than is already there. Our task is to cut back content so that we can see the thing at all. The aim should be to make works of art, and by analogy, our own experience, more rather than less real to us. The function of criticism or analysis should be to show how it is what it is, rather than to show what it means. The place of a hermeneutics, meaning, in place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art, a warm, embodied embrace, a sensual experience. And so as we're plunging into these poems, I want to make sure we take a moment to remember this isn't just about trying to evaluate or interpret them, but to find how we can relate to them and move with them. Some of you have heard me say, I think it was James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, say one time, he said, the etymology of the word explain, explain, those pieces, means to lay out flat. And he said, we've had enough of explaining, of ideas and art. He said, instead of explaining, I think we need to get them up and dance with them. Just as our walking with Hanshan. And two small quotes, which are lovely from the same essay. Sontag quotes William de Kooning from an interview he had done. And this great painter, artist says, content is the glimpse of something, an encounter with a flash. It's very tiny, this content. I love that. It's like the content is what's small. What it opens is what's larger. Content is just a glimpse. A glimpse of what? Into the universal. Oscar Wilde, in a letter to a friend, wrote this in his enigmatic, funny way. He said, it is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. It's only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. The real mystery isn't some interpreted, amazing, difficult to see or to reach thing. It's this. This is the mystery of the world. This life, this body, what's all around us right now. One of our students wrote in response to the homework about a person who had shaped them. She spoke about a good friend in a tropical kind of environment where they lived. And this girl was a daughter of a Baptist preacher, she remembered, and her name was Danny Thomason. Here's what she wrote. Her name was Danny Thomason. She was my next door neighbor. Her hair was a deep auburn color, and she had freckles sprinkled across her face. Danny was always a welcoming friend. All that was required of me was to exit my house, walk across her driveway, up the sidewalk, to the refuge of her porch. Danny was never in a hurry, racing off to do errands or seemingly put upon by my frequent unscheduled visits. She really did see me as she took out crayons and paper for me to draw on. This was my introduction to color and form. Through her eyes, I learned to look closely at the details of the natural world around me, just by taking the time to do it. She never offered any set rules of drawing and design. Our work was experiential, the portal to my true home, the world of seeing. And this is what these Sontag and de Kooning and Weil and Hanshan are inviting us to do. But I think it's difficult because sometimes we don't think we're going to be understood. I remember Hanshan was saying some people might think he's kind of foolish. But here's what he says in poem number 110. 110. When fools read my poems, they don't understand, so they laugh and make fun. When ordinary people read my poems, they think and say, they have a point. When wise ones read my poems, they grasp them with big, full smiles. It's just like Yang Zhu, who saw the ideograph's young female and immediately understood wondrous. So like in some of the Zen teachings, he's talking about these levels of seeing, a capacity. If you're foolish, just brush it away. If you're somewhat thoughtful, begin to see a point. If you're really wise, it's like the Buddha twirling the flower and Ma Kashyapa smiling. It's like, I get it, without having to say a thing. Like when this character, Yang Zhu, I'm not sure who it was, who saw the ideographs for a young female and immediately understood that it was something more, it was wondrous. Here's an example of a wondrous meeting of a female teacher, a young female with big, full smiles. One of our fellow students wrote about a practice center that she was in and how all the teachers were male. And she talked some about this sort of the masculine energy and feeling of practice, and the ways in which she also began to just accept and buy into the feeling of the men being in charge. Here's what she wrote. One day, I received a message to say that our regular male teacher at the time would not be able to attend class that week. Someone named Jackie would come instead. I can remember the slightly disgruntled "oh" that registered as a thought in response. Apparently, I'd become so conditioned to the familiar that my bias expressed itself internally immediately. The evening came and the class unfolded as normal. Jackie led a formal metta practice, a loving kindness practice, and then we talked about metta afterwards. I cannot remember anything she said in her talk, and I was the last to report to her. Somehow I got to saying something about metta and karuna, compassion. I guess it would have been something that I'd read, maybe thought about quite a bit. I remember saying that I was aware that I could feel metta and karuna, loving kindness, compassion, for others, quote, till the cows come home. But for myself, no, definitely no. I would imagine some of you might answer in the same way, actually. There was a pause. There was a particular look from Jackie, a softness, a gentleness of gaze, and then the questions began. Is it true that you can feel no metta for the hair on your head? Yeah. Is it true that you can feel no metta for the skin on your head? Yes. Is it true that you can feel no metta for the eyes in your head? And the questions went on and on. The ears, the mouth, the nose. She writes, now by this time I was beginning to feel distinctly curious and a little uncomfortable. I was being completely honest in my responses. It was clear that Jackie was coming along with me and was not about to give up. She journeyed down through my body with me. Every part was accurately and carefully named. Each time, my answer to the question remained the same. I began to laugh, for there was a lightness and joy to this game. But even when we arrived at my feet, I was still feeling the same lack of care and friendliness towards myself. I said, oh yes, especially my feet, they're so misshapen and ugly. And so on Jackie and I went. Ankles, heels, arches, soles, toes, big toe, second toe, third toe, fourth, and just as she said, fifth toe, the little pinky, I squealed in delight. I've got it, I've got it. I felt love for my little toe and realized that in that instant, that if I could feel it for the smallest of small parts of my body, then I could feel it for the rest of me. Body, mind, good, bad, light, dark, empty, full, form, formless, on and on. I learned so much from that one short journey with that female companion. There was an intimacy in her daring to ask direct questions. Her persistence, our shared laughter. Perhaps this could only have been offered by a woman at that time in that organization. But from then on, my journey began to take me away from it and from that form of practice. So you hear this beautiful story about recovering one's heart in response to oneself, and also recovering a sense of the essence, in this case, of the feminine in practice and how crucial it was. Let's turn a little also to the purpose of Hanshan's poetry. He wasn't trying to become famous or publish great books of poetry. In fact, most of this poetry wasn't even discovered until after he died. So what are they for? And how do the practices open us beyond ordinary doing? Let's look at number 95. A scholar named Wang laughed and said, my poems have many faults. You don't know about hunchback. You don't understand skinny legs. These flat and slanted tones don't rhyme. And there's one cliche after another. I laughed. The poems you make are like a blind person describing the sun. Quite a response, huh? He says your points have many faults. And by the way, and see, I didn't reference it here. Let me see if I can find it quickly. There is an end note on this poem, number 95. Oh, I don't see it here. But you can look it up in the book. Skinny legs, understand skinny legs, understand hunchback. Those are actual references to poetic forms in China of that time. They're not about a hunchback or skinny legs. They're little phrases that refer to certain poetic sequences. So what he's saying is, your poems have a lot of faults. There's a fault called a hunchback, which you don't get, and there's one called skinny legs you don't get. Flat and slanted tones, no rhyming. And there's a lot of cliches. So all of them are just criticisms. But and this is a scholar speaking, so he's scholarly. He's doing the very thing that we were warning ourselves about earlier. But then Hanshan says, but the poems that you make, that understand all that stuff, are like a blind person describing the sun. It's not real seeing, not the real seeing that the little girl with the crayons was being taught, that the woman was being taught by meta practice, by her female teacher. How can you really, really see? Not because you do things right, but because you bring them alive. Here's a further description. Remember the woman who called her teacher from the side of the road in Utah? Here's what she says about another interaction with her teacher. The teacher says, "You talk like a poet. Do you write?" "I used to," I told him. He said, you might consider going back to it." When I did, and it returned full into my life, he used it. He said, "Ask your question the way you write a poem. You don't make the words come, do you?" There must have been some expression on her face because she wrote, his eyes said, "Yes, like that, not making the words come." And later he said, "Make me a poem without words," he said. And I'll stop for a moment. That's a classic kind of invitation about how to respond to a koan. Not verbally, not some description. Be it, act it, bring it to me fully without words. So he said, "Make me a poem without words," he said. Then when I came back to Dokusan, he frowned as I handed him a glass, poured water, rolled a plate. How planned it all felt. Dead. His scowl deepened, and I didn't know how to respond. Then my hand suddenly jerked the plate into the air above our heads, and we giggled. Where did that come from? A gift, like the words to a poem from nowhere. We're back to the person of non-doing, the person of nothingness. One of the questions that I pose as a possible homework is to write down what it would be like if you were actually having a conversation with Hanshan along your journey. And Cassie, who had opened our session with her beautiful writing, wrote this. She, speaking to Hanshan, says, "Whew, well, this doesn't happen fast. How can I meet this insatiable desire?" So we're back to the longing, back to the burning. She's asking Hanshan, how do I meet this insatiable desire? Hanshan says to her back, "I will meet you there. Do you feel my hand gently placed in the middle of your back? Breathe it in and exhale it back to the world. The sun and the moon can handle it. And the pause, a calmness, like the eye of a storm. It will rain again, and the sun will shine." It's such a beautiful poem coming out of Cassie from her conversation with Hanshan. Just like the student with her teacher in Dokusan. Where does it come from? From nowhere. And Hanshan says, when she says, how do I meet this insatiable desire? How do I meet the insatiable desire? He said, I'll meet you. I'll meet you there. This is the commitment and inquiry, isn't it? We'll meet. Do you feel my gentle hand in the middle of your back? Breathe it in. Breathe it back to the world. The sun and the moon can handle it. And the pause, the calmness, like the eye of the storm, it will rain again and the sun will shine. The world will be everything that it is as we breathe together. But he begins to speak to this intimacy that's beyond conception. The student who was writing, the student who called the teacher from the side of the road, writes, "The practice may not be about emotion or about certain beliefs or about a special experience, as my teacher warned. But for me, practice was and is quite emotional. In response to a question once, I threw my arms around him, shattering the norms of Dokusan, and burst into tears. Why am I crying? I sobbed. He said, unity is like that. Unity is like that. It's full. Number 140 in your book. 140. Cold mountain is deep. It fills my heart. The stones are pure white, not gold. Water from the spring resounds as I strum Bo's lute. If Ziki hears it, he will recognize the tune. Cold mountain is deep. It fills my heart. This place that he lives and the place that lives in him, Cold Mountain, is deep, fills his heart. The stones are not gold, they're pure white. Water from the spring is like music. As I strum Bo's lute, if Ziki, I guess it's a friend, he'll recognize the tune. But isn't this what we do, even like in this class, as we read the poems, as we write, as we read what we've written to each other, as we reflect on our lives and appreciate our lives deeply, we recognize the tune, the shared tune. We recognize the shared essence of what it means to be alive. There's something there that's really essential, and it speaks to the longing, it speaks to the burning, it speaks to the desire. There's a very beautiful piece. It's in a larger essay by the American poet Wendell Berry, where he says, we clasp the hands of those that go before us and the hands of those who come after us. We enter the little circle of each other's arms, the larger circle of lovers, whose hands are joined in a dance, and the larger circle of all creatures, passing in and out of life, who move also in a dance, to music so subtle and vast that no one hears it except in fragments. We might play on that lute and we hear it in little pieces, but the real dance is by joining our hands, by connecting through our bodies, by this embodied experience. When we chant the Bodhisattva vow, we chant Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. We vow to embody it. This vow embodies it. We chant, vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction, wearing the universal teaching. So Barry says, to a music so subtle and vast that no one hears it except in fragments. In many ways, Zen practice is about hearing this kind of music, as it were, like the sound of the lute or the sound of the winds or the sound of the water, as Hanshan says. Attending to even its smallest fragments and joining in the dance, if you were, of ongoing experience. This is what Zen is about. The song of the Zen way might be titled Life as It Is. To give your whole life to the intimate encounter with what is right in front of you. Life as it is. Just the life right in front of you, it may sound quite unremarkable. And in many ways it is. However, once we embark on this path of silence and stillness and mindful attention, we began to make the startling discovery that, in truth, we're rarely intimate with life as it actually is. Suzuki Roshi, having learned English as a second language, would often craft phrases in unusual and provocative ways. He invited his students to practice meeting things as it is. Things as it is. In this small, non-grammatical statement, he was able to contain the ordinary truth of the present moment, right alongside the vastness and oneness of absolute reality and absolute truth. Things as it is. In this seemingly unremarkable request to be mindfully present to each ordinary moment and to be intimate with all that was in it, we begin to touch something much larger and quite remarkable. We get a taste of our true nature. It often comes as a surprise to many of us as we discover that we're not living in an intimate relationship with reality. We're habitually and very predictably constructing an internal world of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and assumptions, and then go about living in this virtual reality as if it were the real thing. Without engaging in a reflective or contemplative practice, we literally live in a dream. We live as a dream. And this way of living is the source of ordinary, everyday suffering. The path laid out in our practice and the path to Cold Mountain is the path of waking up from that dream. I think it says in our book that Arthur Waley, who's this renowned British expert on Oriental studies, generation or so back, in 1954, he said, Cold Mountain is often the name of a state of mind rather than a locality. And we spoke about this in our first class, that Cold Mountain isn't just about a place, it's about a state of mind. And he goes on to say that he says this is sort of the hidden treasure in the poems on which his line, the mysticism of the poems is based. And as I read that, I thought, there is a beautiful, somewhat mystical quality to some of the poems, but they're more than just reflections of a mystic. These poems are remarkably resonant with contemporary social, cultural, and political issues. The big virtual realities and dreams, the endless delusions, the deep ignorance that we live with right now. Let's look at number 16, well back in the beginning of section 1. Hanshan writes, people are a country's foundation. Just like a tree depends on the ground. If the soil is deep, it supports the spreading branches. The soil is poor, the tree will decline. Do not expose its roots, or the branches will wither and the fruit will fall. To get fish by destroying a dam benefits you just one time. People are a country's foundation. It's a powerful statement in today's world, whether you're in the United States or in the UK or anywhere else you might be listening to this. People are a country's foundation. Just like a tree depends on the ground. If the soil is deep, the culture is deep. If the concern is deep, if the willingness is deep, the engagement is deep, it supports the spreading branches. The soil is poor, for ethics are poor, our willingness and courage is poor, the tree will decline. Things will wither and fall, roots are exposed. To get fish by destroying a dam benefits you just one time. Yeah, you can blow everything up. You can destroy the government. You can turn everything upside down and you'll get something for a little while. But that's the short game. And our community is essential for our survival. Sangha is a place of refuge for us as individuals, as a family of practitioners. Offer yourself fully and receive each other fully. This is the ground of practice. Esoteric mind states are not the goal or the ground of practice. And this last phrase, as I said, is so contemporary. It's painful to watch leaders work hard for short-term results without any concern for the long view. Our view needs to be the long view in order for it to be wise and for it to be compassionate. Without getting too caught up in politics, I thought it was incredible to read something like number 35. Take a look at that. And I will, this is a very Americocentric view, but I think you'll appreciate it even if you're in the UK. Because the first line, rich people meet at a tall building, all I could think of was that gold building in Manhattan with a certain person's name on it. And also through the rest of the poem about difficulties about immigration and our border. And I think the UK has some of this as well. Rich people meet at a tall building, decorated with shining lamps. When a woman without even a candle wants to draw near, they quickly push her away back into the shadows. How does adding someone diminish the light? I wonder, can't they spare it? This small mindedness, this stinginess, fear. And this could be, that poem actually could be right out of the headlines regarding immigration, racial inequality, poverty. And like I said, the tall building and the poor woman looking for an opportunity. And the exiling of those who are poor or seen as other. And the deep feeling of lack driving those who seem to have the most. Number 62 speaks to this as well. Number 62. How shallow worldly people are. Though human minds are not the same, old man Yin laughs at old man Liu. Old man Liu laughs at old man Yin. How come they laugh at each other? Both of their minds are one-sided. If you compete, piling up loads on a cast, the loads will whoosh down on you. How shallow worldly people are. Though human minds are not the same, you know, you have this imagery of one person laughing at, you might as well be on Twitter here. How come they laugh at each other? How come they lash out at each other? How come they compete? Because their minds are one-sided. They're narrow. They're not full. And if you compete, piling up loads, it's all going to come down on you. And right now, we see many things beginning to tumble down. Through practice, we can be transformed, however. It's possible to no longer be so one-sided, competing for a small, partial bit of ground, which isn't the real treasure anyway. If we compete by accumulating material things, they will bury us. If we compete by attempting to attach to spiritual things, it will all tumble down. Number 48. Rich people have many burdens on their hands concerning matters they just won't accept. A warehouse of poor rice that's turned red, yet they won't lend it to others who struggle. Always ready with a trick. When buying thick brocade, they pick up the damask first. When their lives are over, only green flies will mourn. And the Metta Sutra, it talks about not taking up the burden of riches. Rich people have many burdens on their hands. It's the burden that you don't want to take up. Concerning matters they just won't accept. Once again, straight out of the headlines. That facts, truth, reality just doesn't sink in. And a warehouse full of poor rice that's turned red, Even if it's not the best stuff, if you've got a lot of stuff, why won't you lend it to others? Why don't you be generous? Always ready with a trick. Oh my God. Always ready with the trick. Even when buying thick brocade, in other words, looking at this thick, beautiful embroidered stuff, they pick up the cotton, the damask first, as if that's not what they're going for. But we know what they're doing, always trying to trick us. And you know what? When their lives are over, only the flies are going to mourn, nobody else. And mourning and grief, you know, I think is essential to make sense of the world that we now inhabit. I mean, this world that we inhabit politically, socially, environmentally. We can't forget the basis of our practice, you know, the great matter. Number 57, pardon me, number 57. Look at a flower among leaves. How long will it be appealing? Today, it fears someone will pluck it. Tomorrow, it'll be wait to be swept away. We should pity those who are seductive. After some years, they will turn old. Just compare the world to this flower. How long can youthful beauty last? I walked this morning down the driveway and through the property to open the front gate, and there were beautiful pink hibiscus. But by this afternoon, they'll be curled up on the ground. It's kind of nice to have that reminder. And also when they are blooming beautifully, to appreciate just that moment. Because everything goes that way. Number 52. Who can live forever without dying? Death comes for everyone. I used to think he was 8 feet tall, but all of a sudden, he's a scoop of dust. The underground world has neither dawn nor day, though grass is always green in spring. When I become sad, a mournful wind in the pines kills me. So impermanence is our only guarantee. And there's a certain way in which not understanding this is killing us. And I want to speak about this, what I think of as a larger grief, or maybe a new kind of grief, which we're going to have to come to terms with. Zen teacher Joan Sutherland helps us with a brilliant distinction between Hanshan's world and ours in an essay which she calls Here at the End of the World. Here at the End of the World. I'm going to read a few excerpts. I'm going to read a bit of length here from her recent essay in Lion's Roar magazine, the September 2019 edition. I'd recommend the entire piece. I'm just going to read excerpts and piece them together to make the point that I want to make in reflection to our walk with Hanshan. So this is Sutherland. Grief is a Buddha. Not something to learn lessons from, but the way it is sometimes, the spirit and body of a season in the world, a season of the heart-mind. Grief is a Buddha, joy is a Buddha, anger is a Buddha, peace is a Buddha. You're not meant to cure the grief Buddha, nor it you. You're meant to find out what it is to be part of a season of your heart-mind, a season in the world that has been stained and dyed by grief, made holy by grief. A long time ago, a young woman, Mujaku, is lost in mourning after the death of her husband. She leaves everything behind and goes to a monastery to ask for help. "What is Zen?" she asked. A teacher replies that the heart of the one who asks is Zen. Her broken heart is the Buddha of that time and place. So she decides to stay and find out what that means. Sitting in the dark, the woman runs her fingers over the face of the Buddha of grief, learning its contours. Over time, she discovers a kind of grace in that dark, with grief as her companion. A deep humility, a deep stillness, a deep listening. In its Latin roots, grieving is related to being pregnant. She goes on later, her tears become a solvent for what is unyielding within. She's written about some of the experiences that begin to open. And her tears become a solvent for what is unyielding within. The defenses erect to keep from feeling the pain of life all the way through, which also keeps us from feeling its beauty all the way through. And so I'm just saying parenthetically, turn to the grief that has to do with the planet. Sutherland goes on about the anxiety about dissolving in practice, about letting go, about opening so fully. Some people fear this kind of dissolving. Will I still be me? Will I disappear or go mad? Will I be able to fight climate change? If we begin this weeping, if we open ourselves to the pain and the poignancy and the terrible, wounded beauty of life on this earth, perhaps we won't be able to stop and we'll drown. But we do not disappear, nor do we drown, neither do we cry forever. But if from time to time these tears are called from us, they're no longer frightening. They're a small ceremony keeping us close to the world. They're a small ceremony keeping us close to the world. They make us less brittle, more resilient. We weep because something is pouring in and we're overflowing. Because it's impossible to say anything in some moments. And it's equally impossible not to offer something back. The salt tears are remnants of our oceanic beginnings. And they're also the residue of the difficult sea we cross in this life. And we contain both the timeless depths and the waves washing over the fragile raft that carries us from birth to death. Grief is a form of love. How we go on loving in the absence of the beloved. Grief is a form of love. It's how we go on loving in the absence of the beloved. It is the transformation of love through loss and how we're initiated into a new world. The grief of our time, this time, is a strange one. Because this loss won't be sudden or unexpected, like a plane crash. We've predicted it. It'll go on for a very long time. And even as we mourn, we'll try to salvage as much as we can. Eventually, we might find our way into the eye of the storm, as Mujako did. But there's a difference. And this is the point of my reading all of this. In Mujako's time, and in Hanshan's time, it was possible to love the natural world innocently. Her awakening and his is entwined in an ancient and uncomplicated way, with the deer and the stream and the moon and the trees. She could take something for granted we can't anymore. That the natural world will eternally and self-sufficiently be here to heal and open us. She could take something for granted we can't anymore. That the natural world will eternally and self-sufficiently be here to heal and open us. We can no longer love the earth innocently like that, ignoring the effects of the way we treat it. So, how do we love now, past innocence? How do we stay with that love even when it nearly kills us with hurt? Perhaps letting loss stain our love will help, because it will keep us closer to what's actually happening. Perhaps letting remorse stain our love will help us do what a genuine love must do now, which is acknowledging our debt. We don't cry forever. Grief changes, growing from its wild beginnings into a kind of dignity. Remorse becomes a noble companion. We can't know from here what our love of what's coming will look like, but we can decide how we'll walk out to meet it. Right now, we are so pregnant with the future, pregnant without entirely knowing what's about to be born. We're entering a great mystery together. We bring to this invisible ceremony our warrior skills, our hungers and our strivings, the genius of our minds, all the things that got us here, hoping we'll do something different with them this time. Perhaps we could also bring washed hearts humbled by what we have done, and a willingness to love wherever it takes us as we step into the great ceremony of the rest of our lives. We can't know from here what our love of what's coming will look like, but we can decide how to walk out to meet it. Number 83 from Hanshan. Since growing up, I've been disturbed by the chaos of worldly affairs. But I can't just abandon ordinary people. So I visit from time to time. Yesterday, I went to a funeral of the fifth son of Zhu. Today, we send off Liu's third child. There's not a moment of peace for my sorrowful heart. Since growing up, I think since waking up, I've been disturbed by the chaos of worldly affairs. You're going to be disturbed if you wake up. And I can't just abandon ordinary people, he says. So now we're harking back to that first question in the beginning of class about being a hermit and being in the world. I'm practicing here, but I can't abandon ordinary people. So I visit from time to time, he says. And then he gives these two examples. Yesterday to a funeral of one child, and then we send off another. There's not a moment of peace for my sorrowful heart. So how do we live in a situation in which we're living with sorrow constantly, where grief becomes dignity, where regret becomes our faithful companion? On the number 100, the water of the Yellow River is vast. It's a very big river. The water of the Yellow River is vast. It flows eastward without ceasing, drifting slowly on without ever clearing up. Everyone's life comes to an end. Even if you wish to ride a white cloud, how can you grow wings? During the years when your hair is black, in motion or stillness, give yourself completely. The water of the Yellow River is vast, it flows eastward without ceasing. Vast is the robe of liberation. Practice is vast, liberation is vast, awakening is vast. It flows eastward without ceasing. It will accompany you all the way. It doesn't ever stop. And drifting slowly on without ever clearing up, everyone's life comes to an end. Oh God, I hoped that practice would change me fast and it would clear me up completely. But I've come to learn over the last many decades that we drift slowly on without ever clearing up until it ends. Even if we wish to ride a white cloud, how can you grow wings? You're going to be a human, not an angel, not something else, even though you wish to be free. So during the years when your hair is black, and you're young, in motion or in stillness, either way, give yourself completely. Here's a final personal reflection. In 1997, I did what I thought was, quote, giving myself completely to practice by going on a pilgrimage to Japan with my teacher, Zenke Blanche Hartman, along with her teacher, Sojin Mel Weitzman, and a group of American students who lived and practiced in the old way at Rinsoen, Suzuki Roshi's home temple in Yaizu, Japan. Our host was Huitsu Suzuki, Shunru Suzuki's son, who at that time was abbot at Rinsoen, and Suzuki Roshi's widow, Mitsu Suzuki, or Okasan, as she was called, was an honored guest on certain days. In fact, we celebrated her 83rd birthday on that trip. We visited important temples, participated in elaborate rituals at Eheiji and Soojiji, the two head temples of the Soto sect. And we were guests on the one day of the year when Hakuin scrolls are open for the public to view. These and other seemingly magical events were enthralling and inspiring to me as a much younger man and a relatively new student of Zen. I still thought I could grow wings. But practice is endless. The water of the Yellow River is vast. It flows eastward without ceasing. However, drifting slowly on, these past 22 years, continuing to practice in my everyday life in the United States, my life never actually cleared up as I hoped it would. And so many lives have, quote, come to an end. Okasan died at 101 years of age in January of 2016. 4 months later, in May 2016, Blanche was gone at 90. My hair was still black back then, and I gave what I could. Joy and grief are necessary companions throughout this life. Please continue to give yourself completely. I'm reflecting on this as this is the end of the content that I wanted to offer. And because it's the second time in 2 days I've gone through the content, and I felt so much embarrassment and some despair having forgotten to do the recording yesterday. Well, I'll continue to give myself completely. I will give you these notes, and at the end, there'll be an indication of homework. And there's even a little appendix for class 2. And a piece that we use in the Soto lineage, the merging of difference and unity. I'll start with this next time to give it some context, but you can read about it in the notes. Thank you for your participation. I hope that your small groups or your private listening is fruitful and that you continue your practice, and then the merit of this time that we spent together benefits everyone, everywhere. Thank you.